Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment, Scott Eastwood puts pedal to the metal as he goes into overdrive. Andrew and Garrett Foster, played by Scott Eastwood and Freddie Thorpe, are half-brothers and car thieves who are building themselves a reputation for stealing vintage cars. However, they make the mistake of stealing a Bugatti 1937 belonging to crime boss Giacomo Morier, played by Simon Abkarian, who tracks them down and makes them do a job for him or death. Steal a Ferrari 250 GTI that's the prized possession of Max Clem, played by Clement Schick, Giacomo's rival to control Marseille. Now Andrew and Garrett, along with Andrew's girlfriend Stephanie, played by Ana de Armas, must gather a team together to do the heist and must think fast and drive faster if they're going to come out on top. I want you to imagine, if you will, if the Fast and Furious movies remained terrible, if they never gained any semblance of self-awareness about themselves, if they didn't become a big silly macho soap opera, if they just remained painfully earnest, yet very dull action thrillers about car thieves, what exactly would you get? Well, chances are you'd probably end up with something like Overdrive, which is all too fitting in fact, because it comes from the writers of Too Fast, Too Furious, which I think most people would agree as being the worst in that particular franchise. It nearly killed it right out of the gate with its convoluted plot, its poor villain, and generally just being a very boring movie all around. Overdrive plays like a version of the Fast and Furious series if they didn't course correct themselves after the second film, if it just kept going in that direction. This is probably the sort of movie that we would have ended up with. It also interestingly states that it comes from the maker of Taken, very carefully worded there. Because normally you see that line on a movie and you assume, oh, it's from a script that's written, produced by Luc Besson as part of his EuropaCorp staple. I mean, you see quite a lot of those. That's not actually the case this time. Instead, what that refers to is the director of Taken, Pierre Morel, and it seems that he's had a bright idea of trying to copy Luc Besson's success in trying to make trashy European action films in the English language so he can sell them to international audiences. Well, as it turns out, Overdrive proves that it's much harder to do that sort of thing than Luc Besson makes it appear. But that's not the only link this shameless attempt to copy the success of the Fast and Furious movies has with it, because in the lead role we have Scott Eastwood, who you might recall from the most recent entry, The Face of the Furious, playing Little Nobody, the unenviable task of playing a role that's pretty obviously replacement Paul Walker, but here he's playing the main character, and this isn't something that's really been a surprise because Eastwood has been around for a couple of years now and he's normally played little supporting roles, especially in sort of authoritative types like a cop in Texas Chainsaw 3D, or he was military man in Fury and Suicide Squad, but he's gradually been working his way up to leading man status. Next year he'll be seen alongside John Boyega in Pacific Rim Uprising. But based on the evidence of Overdrive, I just don't think he's cut out for prime time yet. And here's the thing that's somewhat paradoxical about Scott Eastwood. He has the look of an action star. You look at him and he's a very handsome guy and he's got his father's good looks. He looks exactly like his dad. He's the absolute spit of him up until he opens his mouth. And then he just has no charisma. It just dissipates instantly. I hate to compare someone to their father constantly, but compared to Clint Eastwood, Clint has a certain intensity about him, a real kind of grit, and Scott doesn't seem to have that at this present moment. He doesn't seem to have developed that. Maybe he'll grow into that, maybe, but at the moment he just comes across as a very bland lead, unfortunately. He's meant to be the brains of the operation, and he's meant to be the sort of the strong silent type. He's the one that's standing in the background behind his brother. And that's very much in the sort of Clint Eastwood mould, and he's meant to take command of the situation. and he just doesn't hold the screen in the way that he really should do. Admittedly, no one comes out of this movie particularly well because it has a terrible script, but so much of Eastwood's material is really bad because he has to spend a lot of time with Ana de Armas, and speaking of people who are moving on to much better things after this, as she's currently appearing in Blade Runner 2049, she plays his girlfriend, who ostensibly is meant to be the third part of this vintage car thief operation that they're going on, but really all that she does through the movie is that she keeps asking, when are you going to marry me? Because that's the sort of treatment this movie gives her. It ogles her, and all that she has in terms of dramatic material is, am I going to get proposed to yet? Am I going to get proposed to yet? Are you going to give this up and propose to me? So interesting. Never seen that in a dozen films like this. And the movie keeps devoting time to that relationship when really these characters just aren't that interesting. It even stops the climax for the full-on resolution of this, and I'm just thinking, I don't care about this romantic moment. You've got the bad guys chasing after you. I think you could do this at a much better time, quite frankly. The only reason that de Armas is in this movie is so that we have a female character who, into the third act, gets kidnapped and held hostage and used as leverage. And that's not a spoiler, because you've seen that in so many films like this, and I'm quite frankly tired of female characters existing solely for this purpose. Elsewhere, alongside Eastwood, we have a relative newcomer, Freddie Thorpe, and he's just annoying and obnoxious. He's meant to be the loudmouth of the group. He's the one that's always talking and sort of gets them into trouble because of his motor mouth. And he certainly plays that role exactly how it's scripted. It's just that you just don't like the character, especially because he keeps doing stupid things, like how he starts negotiating payments with a group that they're trying to get in, and yet he doesn't understand that while he's talking, the reason they're not replying is because he's in France, they don't speak English. I mean, seriously. And the one gimmick that they have through the movie is that they're half-brothers. They're half-brothers. They have to keep reiterating that. Oh, we're half-brothers. You don't quite look alike. Oh, it's because we're half-brothers. See, my dad slept with another woman. And it's like, I don't care. The gimmick doesn't work. And especially because they actually do look like brothers. There is a little bit of a resemblance. Obviously, the accent isn't really the same because Freddie Thorpe has a British accent, but it's not really as mismatched as it could have been, especially when you look at the casting for this movie. It seems to have slipped through a number of different actors, and at one point was going to be Matthew Good and Alex Pettifer, and then it turned into Carl Urban and Sam Claflin, and then they dropped out. And what you can clearly see here is the second, third, fourth choice for every single role. Clearly this was meant to be a much more star-studded movie than it really is. As it stands, they've ended up getting the up-and-comers, essentially. And the film's clearly going for that team dynamic that very much characterises the Fast and Furious movies, and it's another way that the film painfully tries to copy those films without really pulling it off, because in the Fast and Furious series, it had a whole staple of characters from previous entries that it could draw upon, that we'd already established connections with, and they're played by big, brash, memorable personalities in their own right. In Overdrive, I can't remember any of the group really, and the only one that I did actually remember is because of something dumb happening, and that's the explosives expert. Because he's introduced as failing to save a pastry. It's put inside a safe, and he has to blow it open and retrieve it without destroying it because he's fat. What he ends up doing is blowing up the shack with them inside it. And they walk out as smoke pours off of them, and they go, oh, well, I guess we're having him as part of the crew. We don't have time to find anyone else. Are you sure? He nearly killed you just then over a baked good. But the worst part of Overdrive is that script. It's clear the writers learnt nothing from their previous experience of Too Fast, Too Furious while they're tasked with copying later sequels, because all the problems that I pointed out in that film back in the day, oh, they're present and correct here. In some cases, even more so. So instead of one really boring drug dealer villain, we now have two of them. Fantastic, and both of them are characterised in almost the exact same ways. They try to establish a bit of threat towards our main characters by casually killing off supporting players. One of them, Clem, is actually introduced in a boardroom meeting and doing his version of a hostile takeover by repeatedly slamming the guy in charge of the company, his head on the table until it bleeds on the table, and then assuming control. I'm not sure that's quite how that works. But both characters, they do this, but they don't really seem like they have any kind of threat to the characters. And this is something that goes all the way through the film, because you think for a car movie, they keep it relatively simple and straightforward. No, it gets stupidly convoluted. And the reason this is because it keeps throwing twists and turns at the audience. It used to be that, oh, we're writing an action movie, so every 15 pages we'll insert in an action sequence, whether or not it actually makes sense or not. In this movie, it seems like the writing motto was every single scene will end with a twist, or some big revelation, or something that changes the mechanics of what's happening. And I guess the idea is to try and make the audience feel like they're on their toes, like anything could happen, but the result is that it feels like there's no stakes in anything that's happening because they don't really establish them properly, and the characters just sort of dance through all these escapades they find themselves in, and it just feels very erratically structured. So characters will just wander into a scene, and then suddenly they'll spot someone who works for one of the bad guys, and they have to evade them in a big chase sequence, and you're wondering, why is this happening? And the movie just keeps adding contortion over contortion over contortion, normally for the sake of an action sequence, and clearly the idea is not to focus on the plot, but just the action. And in case you really didn't get that point, the movie is deafeningly loud at points. Really obnoxiously so. Even in exposition scenes, there's a scene where they're talking about what they're planning to do, and it's set inside a nightclub, so we have this pounding bass track all the way through this scene that actually overwhelms the dialogue and fights with it throughout the entire time, so you're actually struggling against it because all that you're hearing is a couple of syllables and boom, 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 and it sums up the entire production in a nutshell. And I know what you're probably saying at this point, Matthew, no one goes to a film like this for story. They go to this movie for two reasons: cars and action. And to its credit, Overdrive does succeed on at least one of those points. In terms of car photography, it looks gorgeous. The vintage cars angle does actually give this movie a little bit of a unique flavour, and especially because the movie spends a lot of time with characters gawping over garages filled with bright red Ferraris, or they look over cars and go, "Oh, is that?" And obviously that's not really for my benefit. I'm not really interested in cars, but if you're a petrol head, you might get a little bit of a kick out of seeing all these cars on screen. They look fantastic, and obviously every effort has been made to make sure they look their best. The camera lingers over every curve of their structure. It just allows the audience to get a real thrill out of seeing these cars on screen. It makes it feel like it's a little bit different from the sort of muscled up sports cars that we normally see out of something like the Fast and Furious series or its other imitators. However, when it comes to using those cars, it still manages to fail at doing that, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I want to talk about the action in the film first, which is to say that I want to talk about Pierre Morel's contribution to the film, because he handled the second unit direction, which, for those who don't know, a second unit on an action film is normally handling the set pieces. And Pierre Morel, he directed Taken, but he didn't do the sequels. Those were handled by Olivier Megaton. And instead what he did is that he followed up with the John Travolta movie From Paris with Love, which was another EuropaCorp film. And then he did that Sean Penn, The Gunman, that political action thriller that really didn't work. And it's obvious that he hasn't really succeeded in capitalising on the success of Taken, and that's obviously why he's trying to muscle in on Luc Besson a little bit. For someone who is best known for that movie, you think the action sequences will at least make up for the storyline. They don't. They're really overdone and hyper-edited to the point where I really lost track of where things were supposed to be. And it's a shame because, again, they've obviously gone to a certain amount of effort and at least using practical effects for a lot of the movie. And unfortunately, the climax is the worst of everything because the vintage cars angle actually works against it. To compare Overdrive to something in its climax, imagine a man going through a midlife crisis and he buys a sports car and the kids are in the back seat and he's got a rule that they can't eat or drink anything lest they ruin the upholstery. Overdrive is the cinematic equivalent of that. Why? Because the climax of the film is that they're driving around in this vintage car and the characters know that they have to resell it so they can't damage it, and the filmmakers know they can't damage the car. So what you end up with is what is supposed to be the big finale of this car film is cars chasing each other through the side of a mountain, weaving in and out of tunnels, nearly hitting each other. Oh no, they nearly touched! It's actually unintentionally funny just how underwhelming the climax of this film is. Because normally the expectation is, oh, you're going to see the car in action, you're going to see it do stunts, and you're going to see it do crazy things. And the actual ending to Overdrive offers none of that. It's just a lot of weaving around and braking suddenly. Oh no, I can't hit it! I can't hit it! It's so lame. It's so bad as a climax to an action movie and so uneventful. It's utterly risible and it's just painful. So no, I really can't recommend Overdrive. It's terrible whatever way you look at it. As an attempt to try and copy the Luc Besson formula, you know what, with those movies, I know a lot of them are really stupid in of themselves, but at least they're dumb fun. Unfortunately, Overdrive is missing the latter part so much of the time. And frankly, if you want to watch a movie like this, go watch a Fast and Furious film. There's 8 of them. It's not like there's a real shortage of Fast and Furious movies. Frankly, Overdrive feels like it's well over a decade late. It feels like the sort of movie that we would have had coming off of the first Fast and Furious that tried to copy its success. Overdrive belongs to an earlier era of your Torques, your Red Lines, and your Biker Boys. It belongs to that kind of era of movies. It feels like a film frankly out of time and totally out of gas. Overdrive is an obnoxiously dumb movie that managed to be a low-rent version of a Fast and Furious film, but also the kind of French action trash that Luc Besson usually makes. Even though Scott Eastwood is from the former franchise, he shows here that just because he's got his father's good looks doesn't mean he can carry a movie, and the writers of Too Fast, Too Furious turn in a script that's just as awful as that flick. This is one of those movies that trades constant twists and forced action beats in every scene, caught between two uninteresting villains that you give up caring what's happening because it makes no sense. On the action front, this barely gets out of first gear despite Taken's Pierre Morel's involvement with over-edited, incoherent set pieces, and the kid gloves they handle the vintage cars with renders the climax a laughable bore. Yes, the cars look pretty, but this chokes on Vin Diesel's dust. If you like this review, then speed on over to my Patreon where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.